back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. For today's third segment of the show, we'll be looking at a fantasy basketball season recap. Obviously, once we get into the NBA Finals, it will be just NBA Finals talk from there on out. But I just want to showcase some of the breakout players, breakout teams of this fantasy basketball season. It was a fantastic one. You had underrated stars. You had rookies vaulting themselves as high as projected to be the number one overall fantasy player next year in terms of that. But just going into this past season, it was a truly fantastic season for a lot of players and teams, so let's jump right into it. Coming in as the number one overall player for the 2023 to 24 NBA basketball season. Could be a shock to some people, but I think that when he's healthy, he is one of the better fantasy players in the league, and that is Joel Embiid. Joel Embiid is your number one overall player, and he proved that when he's healthy, he is on. We talked about him in the last episode for the way too early 24 to 25 fantasy basketball rankings. He did have a very incredible season in the games that he played. Obviously, due to the fact that he did not play as many games as necessary, he could not be voted for MVP, but he would have been in that discussion had he played enough games. He had fantastic stat line, 34.7 points per game, 1.2 steals, 1.7 blocks. Overall, a fantastic fantasy player, both offensively and defensively, because I know a lot of people do value these highly defensive centers who can be presences in the paint and both ends of the floor. So Joel Embiid is your number one overall fantasy player for this past season. As for the number one overall fantasy team, with no surprise, it is the Boston Celtics. Yes, you can say that they aren't a team built around their stars, and that is why there's so many players in the fantasy top 100. They have 5 out of the 7 players that are on that list in the top 100. But overall, that just shows you the balance that Boston is trying to build. Obviously, you can build guys like Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown as your superstar duo over there, but overall, they're just focused on playing unselfish basketball. A lot of three-point efficiency, which especially helped them in terms of being the number one overall fantasy basketball team in terms of that. But overall, I'm really thrilled that the Boston Celtics get their due respect for not just being Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown. You have guys like Drew Holiday, Derek White, even Luke Cornett made the top 200 on this list, which is incredible to see because he's kind of one of those gadget guys, utility guys off the bench for Boston. Also got a guy like Al Horford, who's not necessarily going to help you defensively in terms of fantasy, but obviously his three-point production is a huge asset to fantasy teams. So overall, I think that the Boston Celtics are well-deserved to be the number one overall fantasy team in terms of that their production. I'm really excited to see what they do in the NBA Finals, and hopefully Banner 18 will hang in TD Garden for them because they truly deserve it based on this season. One of the great teams in NBA history if they can clinch that final and take that Larry O'Brien trophy back home to Boston. As for breakout players, I think that you can choose a couple, obviously. A guy like SGA, a young point guard in Oklahoma City who led them to the number one seed in the Western Conferences, could be a sneaky option there. Tyrese Halliburton from the Indiana Pacers, fantastic, well-balanced, efficient season for him in terms of fantasy. You can pick a guy like Domantas Sabonis, who, while he's been doing this in terms of fantasy for many years, you may not necessarily rate that highly because of the fact he doesn't put up major points in terms of his production, but he is one of the more well-balanced, efficient players due to the fact that he has a high level of assists and rebounds. But obviously, you can't talk about breakout stars without talking about who people truly project to be one of the top, if not the top fantasy basketball player next year, and that is Victor Wembanyama of the San Antonio Spurs, number one overall draft pick last year. I really think that people should slow their brakes on this because of the fact that Victor Wembanyama is still developing. It was his rookie season. He's still very lean for a player of his height. He needs to add more muscle. He needs to add more aggression to his game, which you can see the traits and potential that people are talking about and the hype surrounding him. But ultimately, I still think the Spurs are a developing team as well, so they really do need to build that core around Wemby if they want him to be the centrifugal force of this San Antonio Spurs team. I also don't think that Greg Popovich is the correct coach right now to kind of progress him. I think that Greg Popovich is getting up there in years. He could retire sooner rather than later. So we're going to have to see how Victor Wembanyama does progress. But I'm really, really excited to see how next year plays out for him, because he is going to be one of the dominant stars for the next decade or so in this league. So overall, in terms of fantasy basketball, I am really happy with how the season went. We saw a lot of different things happen. We saw a lot of teams rise to the occasion, a lot of players, like I mentioned, SGA and Tyrese, leading their kind of smaller market teams to the NBA playoffs while being very efficient in doing so. We saw Joel Embiid. When he's hot, he's hot. He is one of the best centers, make no ands, ifs, or buts about it, when he's on as a number one overall player. And we saw a team unlike any other in NBA history, one of the best ever to do it in the Boston Celtics. Very well-balanced team, not just Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown, who had those guys producing big numbers for you there. So overall, a team that I'm really excited to see in the NBA Finals. Also, I do want to kind of highlight other teams that kind of broke out in terms of fantasy production. How about the Oklahoma City Thunder? Obviously, we talked about SGA, but a guy like Chet Holmgren, who in my mind can push Wemby as this next big thing as well. They're rivals in this league, and they will be rivals for a long time. So look for Chet to get more efficient as he develops as well. And Jalen Williams is another exciting player on that young Oklahoma City Thunder's team who could progress in terms of his development in terms of fantasy as well. Overall, I think the Oklahoma City Thunder are going to be one of the challengers to the Boston Celtics' throne of being one of the most efficient fantasy teams in the future. Also, I really like the Minnesota Timberwolves this year. There are going to be some question marks heading into the offseason for them, as they are kind of in the weird state of being in the luxury tax, cutting into that second apron. So we'll have to see if they retain most of their talent. But a guy like Anthony Edwards obviously did not really have the best of series against the Dallas Mavs in his first ever conference finals. But he is a fantastic fantasy player, as I mentioned previously on this show. When he is hot, he is one of the best in the league. He does need to develop a better kind of mid-range game, in my opinion. He can't always drive to the basket. So look for his 3-point and mid-range stats to improve drastically, and that will truly help his fantasy stock as well. If they retain guys like Cat and Gobert, obviously they help you defensively. And a guy in Jaden McDaniels and Naz Reid as bench or utility options in your fantasy basketball lineup next year are not too shabby. And finally, in terms of teams that really broke out in terms of fantasy production this year, how about the Dallas Mavericks? Another team where it's not all about their star duo in Luka and Kyrie going into the finals. They have role players who they really liked and developed this year. They got guys through trades, they got guys through the draft, and they really built and structured this team so well. And I'm really excited to see them in the NBA Finals because they deserve it. Guys like Derek Lively and Dan Gafford. In terms of defense, they have been stellar both in the postseason and the regular season. Dan Gafford also very productive in terms of his field goal percentage. Derek Lively, on the other hand, is more known for his defensive prowess. And a guy like PJ Washington, who they acquired in trade, very stout defensively as well. And while he's not known for his three-point production, should that go up, I really do think the sky's the limit for him next year. Look out for him in fantasy draft boards for fantasy basketball, next year. But that will just about do it for this segment of today's show. Coming up on the next segment, we are going to kind of look at the Stanley Cup Finals preview, which is coming up in the last segment of the show, but also how to bet on these finals coming up. What you should watch out for in terms of betting odds for both of these finals. So stick around for that segment. We will be right back.